part 10 of this class, which means we have this week and 3 more weeks of this material. And if you notice, the book only has one more chapter after this. How am I going to stretch one more chapter of closing remarks from his book into 3 weeks? I'm not. There's no way. But there are some things that we can go over that also include eschatology. Since we've been talking about this battle of Gog and Magog and the potentiality of what may happen to America, I think it would be pertinent to also talk about, not today, of course, but talk about what are identified as signs of the end coming that are listed out. I already have notes created for that. I think it would be very interesting and relevant. But last week we went over chapter 8 of March Hitchcock book, or at least the first half, about this big question about what will happen to America during this time, and the seeming lack of remark within the Bible about America in general. Now, we live in a day and age where we're pretty much at the heights of America's influence and America's power. Despite our problems, we're an incredibly influential force upon the world. A lot of countries look to us to set a certain precedence, and they look to us to set a certain standard and dynamic of how we interact with things, whether they agree with it or not. America is a huge influence upon the rest of the world. And rightfully so, because we have an incredible amount of wealth. We have, despite the fact that we're super in debt, we have an incredible military force and presence, a political force, and the waves of change when it comes to society often take place in this large petri dish of America. You see the way America goes, and then you see the world sort of adopt their own version of that. Whether it looks exactly like how America runs things remains to be seen from country to country, but the world looks to us. So, given the fact that America is such a large nation, though rather new in the context of history, 230-ish years, however long it's been since America has been founded, isn't very long in comparison to some of these ancient nations like China or Russia. We've only been around, and we're like teenagers, really, in the historical context. We're still doing a lot of growing and understanding of how we want to run this country, and we haven't really figured that out still. Though we have, of course, foundations in place, but the point still stands. And so the chapter brings up the question, will America survive? And the reason he asked that question, as we discussed last week, is that there are no verses in the Bible implicitly or explicitly that talk about America. In a country that prides itself in patriotism and nationalism, in a country that's so full of itself, really, and the people that are very loyal to America, Christians have a hard time. I'm not saying you guys in particular, but Christians in general have a hard time separating their Christianity from their nationalism. And so for some Christians, it's very difficult to try to work through this idea that America is actually not that exceptional at all. Though there are a lot of exceptionalness to the way America is operated and the type of democracy that we have. I know that there are patriots that could go on and on about everything that's different and new and unique to America. I'm not debating that. But there seems to be a really close connection with being a Christian and being an American. America was not founded by Christians, though there was a Christian influence, and there's always been a Christian influence. Our Constitution does not have Jesus in it. It has the term creator, though our laws are always have some sort of moral um, underpinning to it. Um, God tells us not to murder, so we have laws within our country, of course, that say don't murder people, things like that. Um, America has not been this super always with every leader a Christian. They've been deists, which really means that they just believe in God in general. Um, and so it's even hard to say that we have been this Christian country, though there are a ton of Christians now in America, of course. We have tremendous amount of freedoms that other countries are starting to really suffer underneath. I always think back to China, that has always suffered to some degree of tyranny, that has never really had a country that's been like America, of course. I think of the Chinese church that is currently going through, I think, real persecution. Their governments tracks their people via Face ID. They arrest churches and congregates as well as pastors. I think of Early Rain Covenant Church, one of the pastors there who was sent to prison for 9 years for preaching the gospel. And that's codified. That is governmental persecution. I think I remember reading that now they're telling people to worship the communist leader during their services. If that doesn't sound like, a Nebuchadnezzar type thing to you, I don't know what does, though there's not like an idol that's put up in the midst of the Chinese church. But they tell them you need to worship, to some degree, praise our communist leader within your sermons, or we'll arrest you. They have to go underground more often than not. They're thrown in jail all the time. So they're going under like wide scale persecution. It's hard to corroborate the reports out of North Korea and Christians that suffer at North Korea, though I do think there are believers in North Korea, and I do think they suffer under more severe punishment and torture, but I'm pretty sure there's not as many Christians in North Korea, so it's not as wide scale as it is in China. But they go over all kinds of persecution. They have to remain underground as well. Those countries do not like Christians. They do not like anything that threatens their rule and power. In America here, it's a little, it's a little different. We have a tremendous amount of freedom. Obviously, we're worshiping God today, though there are restrictions and mandates that are in place due to the pandemic. We still are able to worship, though I understand that that's under threat in other parts of our country, and I think unrightfully so that they're under threat. I think the government has really started to overstep their bounds in the way that they've conducted themselves. I understand their intention. I'm not trying to debate. Part of their intention is to help people, but I think they're misguided at best in trying to set a new precedence of their actions against the church at worst. We could talk about that later, but I definitely see the movement of that, and it's not just because of John MacArthur. I've thought this far before. Grace Community Church had been going through what they're going through now. Regardless, we've been a country that has been able to worship freely. It was founded upon freedom of, or religious freedom and persecution from the English church, or not the English church, but England. So we've always had freedom of religion instilled into our core values within this country. So Christians have been relatively free, though they have suffered before, not nearly as in the same ways as history usually pertains to. So it's a unique situation, and so I know that it's very easy to say that America is this great country for Christians, and it is to some degree, but I don't think it always remained that way. I'm not trying to prophesy here. I'm not a prophet, obviously. Those don't exist. So it's hard for me to make hard line determinations. I just, in my own evaluation of the world, and this is just me personally, in my own evaluation of the world, and specifically when America, I don't think Christians will be as free as we have been enjoying for much longer. I don't think it'll be particularly my generation. Um, I think more than likely, and I've said this for a while now. I really think that my son's children will, if not already, if not already my son's children, I think will be under governmental persecution at the rate that we're going right now. I really believe that. I hope not, because I don't want people to suffer. But I believe America is eventually headed, and once we're all old, and I know some of you would call yourselves old, whatever. Some of you already have grandkids. I think when I'm a grandpa, I really think um, this country will look far different than what we see today. I don't think the political lines or the way that society is run and the way that things are occurring now, I think it'll be a night and day difference in 50 to 60 years where we'll talk about the good old days when America was um, more free or something like that. I think we're headed towards that direction. Now, God is sovereign, and we'll talk about that today, of course, um, in the dealings with nations. If God so ordains America to crumble, then America is going to crumble, and it's not for us to um, pity that or be sad about that reality, because I think God knows best when it comes to these things and all things, because He's God. So, um, but we have every right to pray for our country, to try to see the moral fabric of our country be held together. Part of our mandate is to be a light upon the world and salt upon the earth, which we'll talk about also. And Christians have fought valiantly within our sphere of influence here in America to ensure that this country lives in a righteous way, in a way that pleases the Lord. Now, you can't ultimately do that unless you're a believer anyway, because God views the deeds of unbelievers as filthy rags, not because the deeds aren't good in and of themselves and they don't reflect some kind of nature of God, but because the people who conduct the deeds are not right. It's like imagine you're working on a car and you have all this grease and gunk on your hands from cleaning the car, from working on the machine, and you take a clean rag and you wipe your hands on the clean rag. What happens to the rag? It becomes dirty. And so Isaiah says that all of our deeds are like filthy rag. The deeds aren't good. It's because the hands which contain the deeds are dirty, and so it ultimately falls short of God's glory, mainly because it's not done for the glory of God. Of all the nice acts of humanity, which has shown a reflection of God's image on each and every person, the good acts of a person have not saved a single soul, except for the acts of Christ. And so, um, despite all the niceness that can occur in our country, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a Christian country. Anyway, all that to say, it's a real question to ask, simply because we are so influential, simply because we are such a major player in the world's politics, since we are a economic and a military superpower, and we've remained that way now for at least 60, World War II, 70, 80. Gosh, man, what 1945? What is the year 2020? Who can do quick math for me? Is it 80 years? I think that's 80 years. I think that's correct. Okay, I'll just say 80 years. I think it's 80. Um, for about 80 years now, we've been a world superpower, and we grew up quickly within that role. Almost overnight, we became that. Again, in the context of the world, not just in our country's context, but in the context of world history, we became a superpower quick. and remain that status for the time. And that status hasn't really dwindled. I think it's actually grown. In any case, it's weird that a country that's on the same playing field as China, which is in a way mentioned when God talks about the Eastern kingdoms and nations, that America wouldn't be mentioned in end times prophecy, and also especially because of the relationship that America has with Israel and being one of Israel's only real allies within the world. So it's a valid question to ask what is going to happen to America. And so that's what Mark Hitchcock talks about in chapter 8. Will America survive? Because we don't have any verses that talk about America. We don't have even a country name as we identified within other countries like Rosh being Russia. We don't have any country name that is antiquity, the name of antiquity for America, and translated it to our modern context. We don't have that. I don't have any verse that's implicit or explicit about America. America just does not exist in the Bible, as far as it's concerned. So that again raises the question: will America survive? So last week, this is all just way of reintroduction. Last week, we talked about a couple things of what could happen, not to be alarmists, but realistically, what could happen to America that would relinquish at least our superpower position. Not to sit, excuse me, my wife made a bagel with egg, bacon, and avocado, and it was delicious. And I ate it 10 minutes ago, so I'm burping it a little bit. I really apologize for that, but it was really good. We talked about several things of what could happen. Not necessarily that America will lose its superpower status, or excuse me, that America would be completely dissolved as a country, but really it's possible for it to lose its superpower status from a combination of all these things, or any one of these things to an extreme degree, or even the rapture, which we'll talk about today. So not yesterday, last week we talked about an economic explosion. We're $26 trillion in debt and growing, and that grows year by year. $1 trillion, $2 trillion a year, something like that. It's crazy. It's a number that's really hard to wrap your mind around. You personally could not spend $1 trillion in your lifetime, even if you tried. You couldn't spend that kind of money in several lifetimes with several people, even if you tried. And we have 26 of those bad boys that are sitting as a crushing weight that really smart people are trying to figure out the solution to. And I don't know if they have one. And eventually something has to happen with that number. Something's got to give. You can't just be in that incredible amount of debt your entire existence and expect nothing to come from that. So eventually there has to be a reckoning when it comes to these economic problems. You're personally owed almost $200,000 as a taxpayer. Did I say taxpayer? Wow. As a taxpayer. And it's going to cost even $1 trillion just to figure it out on its own. It's just an absurd number that doesn't really seem to be. Again, we live in this like state of luxury, despite the fact that I know that there are poor people in America. I'm not saying there's not, but overall as a country, like we're doing pretty good. Like people live pretty good here. Just generally speaking, I'm not trying to say there's no poverty or anything like that. Just generally speaking, people have it really good here. And even despite the fact we're in debt, but I'm confident that debt has to do something, or we have to do something about that debt, or somebody's going to ask for that money. China's already asking for that money. We have to do something, right? Can America really sustain its lifestyle, its spending, its defense budgets, its education budget, all these things without any money? Of course not. And if it can't supply it via funds, inevitably your status will eventually wither. What happens when the dollar isn't worth $1 anymore? What happens when you have like countries like I think Zimbabwe or something like that has these dollars, this currency. You can have like a trillion, like $1 billion or something like that, and it's like virtually worthless. Think think about living in a country where your currency like is virtually worth nothing. Like no country wants it. You can't pay for things yourself. Even if you had $1 billion, if it's not actually worth what we think it's worth today, then it means nothing. So eventually something's got to give. He also pointed out a potential nuclear nightmare. I again stated last week I think this is personally the weakest argument, and I think he does too. And he only spends a short little paragraph on it. A country, or there's many countries that are accelerating their nuclear programs, trying to get nuclear weapons and capabilities, and there's a potential that a terrorist cell or a bad organization that seeks to harm America to some degree could get what's deemed a dirty bomb, which is like a small nuclear warhead, and just throw it in a city and just watch the country crumble. That's a potential of a realistic scenario, but I really believe that that's the weakest of it, and I don't think our government is that incompetent to allow a nuke to come into our country without us knowing about it, or completely prohibiting that from happening at any point in time. We have a good missile defense system. We have very smart people that work on this problem around the clock in the government, and I think they do a really good job. We have a safety in America that I think is a little bit taken for granted because most of what we do is kept under wraps when it comes to dealing with threats. That's just the nature of the beast. But that's okay. You don't need to know all the good things that people do. You get to enjoy the benefits of that. And I think that is something that America does well. Is it does protect its people very well when it comes to external threats like that. So I really think this is the weaker of the argument. I don't think a terrorist cell is going to smuggle a bomb and set it off in Manhattan. Personally, I think it's a little. I think it's a little much to consider. Could it happen? Of course, but I don't think it will. And one of the big ones we talked about also last week was a moral cave-in. We kind of trekked through Romans 1, I believe it was 21 through 26, about that passage regarding 21 through 32, excuse me, regarding the collapse of a nation. Mark outlines 4 different types of God's wrath: a direct wrath, which is very cataclysmic. You think of Sodom and Gomorrah and something like that. Eschatological or end time wrath. It's the wrath that will be poured out during the tribulation, so God's righteous wrath against the world that'll wipe out a majority of humanity. And eternal wrath, so this is the wrath that people will suffer for all eternity. That is one of the main reasons why we preach the gospel to people, so that they would not suffer that. And that's one of the main reasons why, not the only reason, of course, but one of the main reasons why, and you should be thankful for this, quite honestly, that you don't have to suffer the wrath of God, that Christ took it for us. So we don't have to suffer that, and that's great. But people will, and people will suffer God's wrath for all eternity. It's an eternal wrath, and after 1 billion years in hell, it's as if they just started their term in hell after 1 billion years. And so it's hard to wrap your mind around an infinite number, an infinite time, but it's just going to be just the worst. And nobody wants to experience that. I don't care who you are, you don't want to experience that. But that God will have his judgment in that, and it will be righteous and it will be just. We all deserve it, but God is merciful. And then he also has what he deemed a lesser known form of God's wrath called abandonment wrath. And this is what was outlined in Romans 21 through 32, that essentially God can just abandon a nation and let it run its course. It doesn't mean God doesn't remain sovereign over the nation, but he removes his restraining hand and allows the evil to essentially destroy the nation as a rot from the inside, and eventually the nation will collapse. And one of the main ways of seeing that And one of the main evidences is a sexual revolution that occurs in a country. We're already in the midst of that. I think we're in the hunger pangs of it. Honestly, I don't think it's there yet. To be quite fair with you, um, the atrocities of sexual perversion can reach a newer height that we have not seen in this country just yet. But I think we're on the brink of it. Um, there seems to be no stopping it. Quite honestly, there seems to be no stopping this constant uh, denigration of our fabric when it comes to the family model, when it comes to um, the marriage model that's prescribed in the Bible, um, when it comes to relations, when it comes to relationships between a man and a woman. That's been under attack for quite some time. And the way that a culture usually adopts these things is that it's kind of slowly introduced to a society over time. So it's a very slow roll. Um, there's a little bit of shock initially, but if it's kind of spoon fed a little bit, it's easier to take in. There may come a day. I was listening to a podcast from a friend this weekend who said it like this. He goes, "There may come a day where in the future, in 50 years, we'll look back and think about the good old days where people were just advocating for two men to get married. That'll be like in 50 years, it's possible that that'll be like, you know, what we kind of look back to as a way of gauging how far society has shifted in their mentality when it comes to things like this. That just 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 the concept of only two men getting married was our fight, and America has taken that wholesale, and eventually in years to come we'll look back and think, man, wasn't it in a way great where we could see just this one thing and like know it and identify it and fight against it, but now we have all these things that we have to fight against now. Like that'll be the good old days, is when we were just talking about, two gay men getting married, which isn't even a marriage. It's like an unnatural union. I wouldn't even call it a marriage. I don't recognize it as marriage. The Bible sure doesn't, and neither does God. I don't care if the state recognizes it as marriage. It doesn't make it a marriage. In any case, so part of these hunger pangs of God abandoning a country, and I use that term loosely. I'm just being clever here. Is this sexual revolution that occurs? It's a rejection of God that stems from rampant sexual immorality that culminates into a revolution of homosexuality, and then eventually the ratification of evil. We're kind of already there in stage 4, to be quite honest. I mean, we already have laws now in place that have codified homosexual relationships. So within our fabric of our country now, we're as gay friendly as can be. They don't, and I'm not saying don't be friends to homosexuals. That's not at all what I'm talking about here. But I just mean that as a country, we have codified into law that this is now the law of the land. If you think about that for a second, that is what it means for God to give them over to these debased practices and minds. God has literally allowed within our country for us to have laws in place that sanctify this type of union within our country. So we're already in the state that God has, in a way, abandoned America, and you need to kind of work through that a little bit. They may not seem like a real statement, but just again, because we have to base these things on the objective standard of God's word. This is what Romans 1 tells us. When you see this within a country, when you see this within a people group, this is what that means. And so we see that here. God can, at any point in time, begin to shift the hearts of a nation. And we'll talk about that. I'm still a little bit of introduction here. But God can shift the hearts of a nation at any point in time. And I believe he does that through the preaching and teaching of his word, and the lives lived by Christians as a testimony to the country, to demonstrate how we are as human beings and creatures to respond in light of the fact that we are creations that are saved by grace and sanctified by the Holy Spirit through the atoning work of Christ, and how we are to live in a consistent way with our worldview, with our scriptures, and with our God. I believe that a country is ripe to have their hearts changed because of that. Christian influence is incredibly powerful, and don't think that it's not. Even if it doesn't feel like that, because the more that Christians are trying to voice a very boisterous stop to this country, if we're trying to yell stop and think, even if it doesn't seem like the country listens, I'm telling you right now that the influence of the church is so powerful because of God, not because of anything inherent in us, but because of God, that at any point in time, a country can be swayed back to truth. So it's not as if this country is just lost forever. I don't know if that's God's will, and I would be a fool to say that that's God's will. I just see the trajectory of where we're going today, and I don't have a whole lot of confidence that that is God's will. But that's only because, retrospectively, I can only see what has occurred in the past, and that can be a fallacy in and of itself to observe the past and make predictions about the future. But that seems to be the trend of the country. Could be wrong, but I don't think I am. So now we come to our notes here. And this is a big one. He identifies this concept as of a second civil war. 150 years ago, our country was locked into a battle, amongst other reasons, but of course one of the main reasons was chattel slavery that was occurring for 400 years. The imprisonment of slaves from Africa and other nations, and the absolute torture of black people within our country. And so our country fought because of that, as well as other reasons, but that was a huge reason why. And just so you know, the Bible decries and denounces and gives strong reason and justification that is not supported at any point in time within Scripture. If someone comes up to you and says slavery is supported in the Bible, they're wrong. They have no idea what they're talking about. The Old Testament is very clear about God's mind on that, what he thinks about people that are kidnapped and sold into slavery. God hates it and says to kill a person if they do that. So to ever think that the Bible supported that kind of slavery is wrong, and they don't know what they're talking about. But he brings up this point of a civil war too, and he's not wrong to do that. It is no secret, here are the notes, that racial tensions in America have been incredibly high. Especially as this election cycle machine has been churning now, mass media as well as political, secular, and religious thought leaders have been on the offensive as to sway the audience that is the American people. Could America see another civil war in our lifetimes? Is it possible in our day and age that conservatives and liberals would actually take up arms as happened 150 years ago? He says there is no doubt that America is currently locked into a fierce ideological, political, and cultural war. Would God allow something like this to happen? Well, he allowed it already 150 years ago. Excuse me. And just to be clear, 150 years ago isn't that long ago. 150 years ago was like several generations. I remember watching on YouTube, there was an interview on television of a guy who knew Abraham Lincoln. If like, just to kind of put that in context, like in like the 1960s or something like that, this guy went on TV and remembers as a little kid, I think either meeting Abe Lincoln or hearing him talk or something like that. He remembers as a little boy Abraham Lincoln. 150 years ago is not that long ago. We had people on literal television, live TV, talk about their experiences with Abraham Lincoln. So to think that 150 years ago was super forever ago, it really wasn't. Um, and in the world's history, that's just another day. 150 years ago is nothing. So God allowed it in the past. He has every right to allow it in the future. And I have some verses here just to kind of make that point clear. Not that he would, but that he's sovereign to do that. I know you understand God's sovereignty, but let's talk about it a little bit. Romans 13:1 says, "Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God." So governments and nations are established by God. I think Pastor Plumley talked about that a few weeks ago or a month ago. Proverbs 21:1, "The king's heart is like channels of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he wishes." Isaiah 46:11, "Calling a bird of prey from the east, the man of my purpose from a far country. Truly I have spoken, surely I will bring it to pass. I have planned it, surely I will do it." Um, in relation to this, God is talking about a nation that's far away, and he's saying that if I plan something to happen in this nation, I'm going to do it, right? Even, of course, even Jesus recognized this, and he said this to Pilate during his trial. He said, "You would have no authority over me unless it had been given you from above." Jesus understood and of course, knew that God was sovereign over governments and nations. The most Daniel 4:17, that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men. So there is an understanding that God has absolute sovereignty over the dealing of nations. Whether men stoke the flames of conflict, a bullet will not be fired unless God grants the right to do so. So it needs to be clear that these things could happen. But again, we don't want to be alarmists and just merely ring a bell and say, watch out for this to occur. I'm not saying that it will occur, but I would be naive to say that it couldn't. This is where clarity and confidence, though, of events needs to have biblical direction within our minds and hearts that will put us at ease. We don't talk about these things again. Christ was very clear not to allow these things to frighten us, to be anticipating his return because of these things. And so it's not something that is supposed to scare us. It doesn't mean that we can't be concerned in a rightful manner about these events and these certain dealings. It isn't to say that we don't care about these events and certain dealings. It is to say that they're not to be cause for fear. There's a difference. So God would allow another civil war in this country if he has ordained it. If not, then all the current contentions in our country will not result in physical violence. They just won't. If God has not ordained it, if our country has not been sovereignly planned to have a second one, then it's just not going to happen. If it has, then it will. This is where we need to have of clarity of the sovereignty of God, because when he deals with a nation, he's going to do as he sees fit to bring about the purposes ultimately of his end goal. And what is God's end goal? To glorify himself forever. That is his end goal. And to save a certain people from his wrath, and to give a love gift to his son that is the bride of Christ. Those are God's big goals in life, in our lives, and in the history of the universe and of heaven. God desires to glorify himself. So whatever happens in this world and now in this level of national threat is going to be for God's glory. It will. And if it doesn't happen, it also will be for God's glory. There's a quote here in the book that I'll read. It says, "Speaking after the House voted along party lines to improve a measure establishing procedures for the impeachment inquiry." This was recently, of course, from the impeachment of Trump. Representative Louis Gohmert, a Republican of Texas, said that House Democrats were, quote, "about to push this country to a civil war if they were to get their wishes." that's not the important part that I care to talk about. Here's what I care for him to say. He then added, and if there's one thing I don't want to see in my lifetime, I don't want ever to have participation in a civil war. Some historian, I don't remember who, said guns are only involved in the last phase of a civil war. That's the point that we're talking about here. So it isn't that a civil war isn't occurring in our country to some degree. It's that we haven't taken up physical arms within our country. That there's a difference. Now, it isn't also to say that there hasn't been violence in relation to something like this, because there has. But in the grand scheme of things, the threat of a civil war is just a symptom of the current divisions within our country. And these divisions have repercussions to allow a fracturing within our nation and to exacerbate the other issues as well. And I'll get to the main point at the end of this of what I think is more than likely to occur, not when it comes to just a civil war. But he gives several reasons for the collapse of America should it occur. I have an answer. I don't know if it's right, but I have a prediction. It would be naive to assume one way or another in relation to whether or not a civil war would happen, but we do have tension in our country, and there's no denying that. The battle within America is not physical, at least currently, but it is ideological. There are waves of change that have occurred in the societal shift towards different ideologies that have undergirded our country so far. And I worded that a little wrong. I'm sorry. What I meant to say is that from the foundations of our country that we've had in the past, there has been a shift toward these new and different ideologies. That's what I'm trying to get at. I think I worded that a little wrongly. I apologize. So if that confused you a bit, please rewrite it in a way that makes sense. We had a core foundational set of beliefs and underpinnings within our country, and we're shifting away from that, is what I'm saying. March Hitchcock notes a Washington Post article titled, "In America, Talks turn to something not spoken of for 150 years, Civil War." He provided a longer quote from Dr. Hansen, who was referenced. And I'm just going to, I know I have part of the quote here, but I'm just going to read the whole quote. He said, "Almost every cultural and social institution, and there's a lot that could be talked about even within this statement. Universities, the public schools, the NFL, the Oscars, the Tonys, the Grammys, late night television, public restaurants, coffee shops, movies, TV, stand-up comedy has been not just politicized, but also weaponized. The U.S. stands at the brink of a veritable civil war." What does he mean by that? Well, essentially what he's saying is that everything within our country, all the big foundations, media and entertainment, education, like law and business, and all these foundational aspects of a society and foundation, marriage and family, of course, religion, all these things have been weaponized, and ideological factors have been injected into every aspect of these underpinnings and foundations, and it's purposely done to divide. And I can spend way more time than we're going to spend today talking about that, and I really hope to in the future. But just understand, and if you have questions about that, I'd be more than happy to answer in specifics. But understand that this is something that's designed to divide. We'll talk a little bit about it in a little bit. We must understand that America's divide does not stem purely from racial tensions. To say all, and only for that matter, white and black people are divided is to misunderstand the issue. These can be called a sort of pangs and symptoms and indicate a more foundational problem. Hear me when I say that I'm not saying that there aren't racial issues in America, and that they're not racial tensions within America. I understand that there are. I'm not saying that they're not, and I'm not saying they're not important. So understand what I'm saying here. To only say that these things are occurring right now and are the the foundational problem is to misunderstand the issue. And again, if you have problems with that statement, we can talk about it. These can be called the sort of pangs in systems that indicate a more foundational problem. Objectivity, morality, sexuality, religion, truth, justice, marriage, etc. have all been under attack for some decades now. The result of that attack has culminated into the unbelieving world to find issues with core Christian foundations and to undermine them at every turn. When the church tries to speak truth about these matters, the world rejects that, and they fight back about it. And what they do is they take a little bit of the truth, and they take more lie, and they take this lie and they wrap a thin layer of truth around that lie, and they present it as these Christian ideas. This is what Christians need to be concerned about. If you hear that from the world, be very careful about what they're saying. When the world tells you how you are to think about Christianity and about what your religion is supposed to be very, very careful about how you listen to them. Because the world has no idea what Christianity is. I don't care if they can talk doctrine. They have no concept of experiencing it. They have no concept of truth, except that which is imprinted upon them as being image bearers of God. But for an unbeliever to tell you that you are to be a Christian in this way is for them to overstep their bounds, because they have no idea what they're talking about. I don't care if they say, I was a Christian for 20 years and I walked away from the faith, or I walked away from organized religion. I don't care. They have no business telling Christians how to live. They love to do that. The world loves to tell Christians how they're supposed to act. It might be very difficult because there's a lot of noise, but don't let the world influence the way you are to think as a believer. Your main influence isn't me. It isn't the elders of this church. It is foundationally the Bible. Ultimately, our foundations for how we're supposed to live is the biblical text. The problem is not with the Bible, it's with the interpreters and the peddlers of certain ideologies who take some little truth of the Bible and wrap a lie within that little truth and then give it to you and say, this is how Christianity is supposed to be. Here's an edgy title, The New Segregation. And I titled that for a reason, we'll talk about it. When George Floyd was killed, it was as if someone had pushed the handle of a dynamite box. We saw the outcry for justice immediately. As a matter of fact, since 2009, there have actually been 33 wide-scale racial protests and 10 instances of multiple riots concerning an event deemed racially charged against Black people in America. 19 of these protests and 7 of these riots have taken place in the past 5 years. More and more do we see conversations and signaling from the world that we have a justice, moral, and truth problem in America. However, rather than the world telling us these things are true, it is the church that must take charge in this conversation. And I know that can be a hefty statement, but understand that we cannot be swayed only by the world's viewpoint of stuff, just in general, but especially when it comes to matters like this, you have to be very careful as a believer to think about who you're listening to. Are you listening to believers talk, or are you listening to the world convince you of certain things? And I know that that's too general of a statement, but I'm running out of time a little bit here. I apologize for that. Unfortunately, the world has taken control of this narrative and told us that we are more divided than ever. We are placed into groups, and Pastor Luke talked about this a little bit last week. We are placed into groups rather than treated as responsible individuals. And we are told that these groups we belong to do not get along and cannot get along unless we all abide by the world's idea of unity. Instead of being yourself, you are grouped into a race, ethnicity, wage category, gender, biological sex, age, abled or disabled group, and given your status and moral justification for how you are grouped. The bottom line is that this concept of what is called identity politics, critical theory, and intersectionality has bred further division while under the guise of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Further division leads to more tension, and that tension has been demonstrated in small skirmishes to result in hostility. That isn't. I'm not saying anything crazy here. This isn't unheard of. Um, does mass media sensationalize things? Yes. If one riot happens in the country, does that mean the whole country is rioting? No. If one riot happens in one state and another one happens in another state, do we have an entire nation of riots? No. If you want to look at national protests and riots, again, look at China. They are still protesting. They are still going through governmental persecution. They are still dealing with tyranny within their country, and there are millions of them that are dealing with this, and they're still almost protesting still every single day, and by the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, every single day. So the point is, though, is that there have been small instances, just very, very small instances relatively within our country where things have become violent. And as a result of that violence, there are some people who have died. There was a father whose son was in the chop zone. If you remember the chop zone, I know that feels so far away ago, but it was like a month ago. And this year has been crazy. The chop zone was this experiment of pushing out all police force and all medical personnel, government medical personnel, I'll just say that, and all forms of legislator, whatever. They created this little square, okay? And they didn't allow anybody that was identified with police or government or whatever into the zone. And so there wasn't a police presence or anything like that. Within a couple weeks, it quickly devolved into violence. Several people died, and I remember listening to an interview from a father who lost his 19-year-old son because his son was shot and killed, and emergency personnel was trying to get into the chop zone, and they were prohibited from getting to the chop zone, which could have been able to save his son. And he didn't know about it until a couple days later. His friends told him. He never got a call from the police, and he never got a call from any sort of governmental authority. Say what you will about Trump. I'm not saying he's a great person. Please hear me correctly. In this one instance, at least, though, Trump was one of the first people that called him to apologize for the death of his son. He wondered why in the world something like this would happen. And he was heartbroken. I had a hard time watching that interview as a new father, just imagining what I would experience if I lost my son to that degree. He couldn't even see his son for 2 weeks. They wouldn't let him look at his body for 2 weeks. So he didn't even know if it was his son for 2 weeks. So I can't imagine that type of torment. But anyway, just in that small note, this type of rhetoric, and these divisions within our country, and these now new manufactured, I believe, manufactured divisions with intersectionality and identity politics only seeks to divide more. It does not seek to include more. It can't, by definition, because you are grouped and you are told that you can't, unless you do it our way, you'll never ever be unified. And when the world tells you this is how we're going to be unified, you need to be very careful about what you listen to. Whether America reaches a boiling point that culminates in large-scale physical conflict or not remains to be seen. However, the current trajectory of our country's instability is unsustainable. We cannot keep going down this path. Not this path, not the moral cave-in, and not the economic implosion. It will have major repercussions to come. It can't not have major repercussions to come. These things won't just fizzle out, and even though the world tries to do its best to dumb our minds and to numb us with entertainment and amusement and all sorts of sensationalization, It's very hard to get a clear picture about anything anymore. It's very hard to trust any media source. You have to look really hard to find something reputable, and even then, they have hit or misses. Um, but understand that all this is very unsustainable. You just there has to be repercussions. Either something really good happens and our country turns away from these things and seeks after the Lord, which is well within God's right to do, or it doesn't. Um, Now, I just want to separate something here. My personal belief is that March Hitchcock in his book, and you see it on the next page or the next line, it says the rapture. He believes that the fall of America will occur during the rapture. And just as a spoiler warning, anyway, he believes that once 20 to 30 potentially million people are raptured from the country, that it'll plunge the country into darkness, which I think is true. I think once you remove the sanctifying force of the church and Christians from the world, I don't think there's any stopping it at that point, of course. But I believe, and this is just me personally, just want to make that clear, I believe that the culmination of the things we've already talked about will eventually result in the decline of our country to the point that we will no longer remain a superpower. That is my estimation. I could demonstrate that a little bit more clearly, probably in one-on-one conversations when there's more time to talk about it. Because it's a class, I don't know if I have time to do that. That's my estimation. I don't think God is going to wait till the rapture to demonstrate that He has really abandoned this country. I just do not think so. And I see the trajectory and the way that things are being set up. I don't think we're in the midst of it right now. I think things are being set up currently to be a perfect storm of just stuff. A lot of this stuff is going to happen, and it's going to be really bad. I know that's like the most general thing in the world, and anybody could say that. But just given what we've talked about, I believe that these aspects will eventually culminate into a wide scale and ultimately destructive trajectory. But to what March Hitchcock says, which I don't necessarily disagree with him, if America survives and he is right, the rapture will completely decimate this country. He says it like this: the Bible predicts that a day is coming when the bride of Christ will suddenly be whisked away to heaven in the time it takes to blink an eye. All over earth, believers will suddenly disappear. As we previously discussed, the rapture will be a type of cataclysmic event, unprecedented in our world. Only two people in history have ascended to glory. Raptured officially. Not raptured, but ascended. I don't know. I don't know if you would characterize those as the same thing, but Enoch and Jesus went to heaven. Jesus obviously died first before he ascended to heaven and stayed with his disciples for 40 days and was had a lot of eyewitness testimonies to his physical resurrection and all those things. Enoch was whisked away, we are told in Genesis. He walked with God, he lived righteously, and God took him. It isn't to say that other people haven't been ascended to some degree. I think it's Philip in Acts that after talking to the eunuch and witnessing to him, and the eunuch gets converted and gets baptized, the Holy Spirit literally takes Philip and raptures him away. Elijah too? Sasan? Yeah, I'm sorry. Please edit those notes if Elijah also got taken to heaven as well. And make it say only 3 people in history have ascended to glory: Enoch, Elijah, and Jesus. I think that's right. I just completely forgot about him. I apologize. But when Philip witnessed to the eunuch, and the eunuch got converted and was baptized, the Holy Spirit literally took his body and whisked him away. And it's the same idea. He was raptured away from where he was. It's like, one moment Philip's there and one moment he's not, and he's in the sky and being dragged. I think of it like a movie. It's hard to like picture something like that actually happening, but that's what the Bible tells us, so it's true. When believers are taken up to glory, it will bring the world into utter chaos, which I think is true. I think we don't quite realize, because we live we live in this world where Christians exist, where God's influence upon the world is still heavy, and there are still a lot of people being saved, and there are still a lot of societies that actually love Jesus, which is fantastic, right? So it's really hard to really understand what it means when when this restraining hand of God is essentially lifted up. We have ideas of that. We see symptoms of that within our current trajectory, even in America, but all over the world. Um, and it even talks about it in Genesis. I have double quotes here on point D. I really need to edit these better. I apologize. But we have the accounts of Noah in his day, right, where the world just was constantly drinking down iniquity, constantly. That was what they were. They were just evil. Everybody was just evil. Nobody cared. Nobody loved God. Only Noah and his family, and they were spared for that. The ark is a type of Christ. Get in the ark. Don't wait. Get in the ark. God's going to shut the door. There's nothing you can do about it. You either get in and live, or you don't and die. Um, and I'm sure that that's what Noah preached to people while he was building the ark for 120 years, however long it was, 200 years. Um, I'm sure he preached to people and said, "Get in the ark," and they said, "No, not going to get in the ark. You're crazy." The same way that we preach to a lost and dying world, and we're telling them to get into the ark. Um, we're going to be bathed in fire this time, not in water. The world says, no, I don't see any indication of that. You know, there's there's no reason to believe that. In any case, but we're told that they drank down iniquity like it was essentially water. Everybody was evil, and they were just doing evil things and thinking evil thoughts all the time. That's all they ever did. And so God wiped out the world, and He was right to do that. Um, but we in this new covenant age live as lalt. I said lights and salt at the same time. Lalt. This is being recorded too. Can you edit that? I'm just kidding. That's a joke. Matthew 5:13 says, "You are salt of the earth." This is Jesus talking to his disciples. You are salt of the earth. He also says that we are light upon the hill. We are to demonstrate our Christ likeness to the world, and we are to be the saltiness upon this world. Salt is a purifying agent. It keeps things clean. One of the major agents of God's restraining hand of evil within this world is the church. It's us, the bride of Christ. By the way we conduct ourselves, living righteously and combating unrighteousness, we act as a purifying force amongst the nations where we have influence. Not every society accepts that. Not every society believes that, and not every society is totally privy to that. And quite honestly, they're hostile towards that. But regardless of how the world thinks of these things, we are as a church to be a purifying agent upon the world. That is our calling. When you walk into a conversation and people know you're a Christian, they're going to act a certain way. They're going to say certain things. You know, I often tell accounts of times where I talk to my unbelieving friends back home in Texas, and they cuss up a storm all the time. I used to cuss up a storm. I'm not trying to be judgmental in that sense, but it's they live unrighteously. They do a lot of party stuff, and I used to do the same exact thing too. Um, and but when I have conversations with my friends from Texas, and I start talking to them about the things of the Lord, when I get a chance to, their attitude and the things that they talk about quickly change, and it's almost immediate. They go from talking about girls and talking about bars and talking nasty and all these things, and then I start bringing up things about Jesus or something like that, and all of a sudden it's like they've been Christians their whole lives. It's really silly to listen to on occasions, but it's mainly because we grew up in cultural Christianity where people weren't actually believers, but they were all Christians. I knew how to talk like a Christian. I thought I was fooling people, to be quite honest, into believing I was saved, but nobody ever thought I was saved. My parents certainly didn't. The people at the church that I went to certainly didn't. I thought I was convincing people, but I had no idea what I was talking about, and I certainly didn't care. But I knew how to talk like a Christian, and my friends did the exact same thing. We talk about Jesus, and all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, I love the scriptures, and I haven't been to church in many months, but I go with my parents, and I really appreciate their influence in my life and all these things. But it just sounds, it's a very cultural Christianity, and it's not salvific, I don't think. Now, do I know for sure? No, but I see evidence that they're not saved. Anyway, while there are believers, quote, in every nation, about 5 to 10% of Americans, which wrap your head around that statement, first of all, I'll say it like this, only 5 to 10% of Americans profess faith in Jesus Christ alone for salvation from sin. He's very clear about that statement. The reason he words it like that is that there are a lot of people that profess to be Christians, but not all those people who profess to be Christians also profess faith in Jesus Christ alone for salvation from sin. That's the distinguishing marker there. So if that comes as a little shock to you, it shouldn't. There's a really good research center called Pew Research, Pew Center, something like that. Pew Research. I'm gonna Google it. Pew Research. Yeah, Pew Research Center. I had all the words there. They do a lot of religious studies too. They do a lot of pollings and all of that. And as I talk, I'm gonna pull up an article that I read the other day. And you would be surprised at the number of people that are just falling away from Christianity. Here, majority of Americans don't believe they need God to be good. The Pew Research Center surveyed 38,000 people in 34 countries between late June and early October 2019 to measure the connection between personal beliefs and God and morality. The numbers indicate that although 70% of Americans believe religion is either somewhat important or very important, more than half claim God is not necessary to be moral to have good values. Here's another one. Christianity continues rapid decline in the U.S. as numbers of nuns, quote unquote, swells. Essentially, 43% of U.S. adults identify as Protestants, down from 51% in 2009. 20% of adults identify as Catholic, down from 23%. 4% identify as atheists, 5% as agnostics, and then 17%, this is an interesting number, describe their religion as nothing in particular. What does that even mean? I don't even know what that means. It means that they're religious and spiritual, but they're not. Anyway, we're out of time. Oh my goodness. I can't believe I was able to manage that. Okay. I don't want to cut this talk short, so we'll pick this up next week, since I'm really glad that we didn't finish, because that means I have more material to go through.